Hi guys, welcome to this Mixdown session. So we finished the production, composition and arrangement phases now, and we're moving down into the mixdown. So I want you to try and remain objective and treat this track as if you've been given it by a friend or you've been given it by someone to mix down. So nice objective decisions, and don't be going back into the arrangement or the production process if you can help it. What I've done for this mixdown process is I've written a little bit of a step-by-step guide so you can work through each stage and you should have a good mixdown by the end of it. Something I need to mention about this mix process is that although I've written it in a very linear way, in reality it's actually a very back and forth process. So as we go through the stages such as balance and pan, stereo imaging, and then we're moving on to things like EQ and compression and reverb, you do need to be able to go back and forth into some of these different stages and make fine tunes as you pick up on things within the mix. So rules are there to be broken, and remember this is a guide and not a definitive process. The final thing I want to say is only apply processing if you think it's definitely needed, so try and justify every single process you do, and if you can't justify doing a certain process, then just don't do it at all, because sometimes less is more. On that note, we're now going to start the first stage, which is the mix preparation. What I mean when I say mix preparation is basically just general housekeeping. So that means things like making sure our clips are all set up properly and they're all in the right order, color coded and renamed as they should be. We've set up all of our routing and our buses, we've set up all of our effects, and everything is good to go, so we can just look at the project and we know exactly what we've got to do, and we're not going to waste any time or waste any creative thinking later on having to go back on ourselves to do technical tasks. So let's crack on with the mix prep phase. So here we have a blank project, and all I've done is I've imported the reference tracks from our production project. So just to show you, if we go into the arrangement, you can see that these tracks are spread out along the arrangement, and we also have our mute switches on our left and our right bracket, which are working just as they were in the last one. So now that we have our reference tracks in place, what we need to do is we need to bring in our parts. So what I'm going to do is just go back into the last project that we saved and just drag in the parts MIDI clip or the parts track. So if we go into the arrangement, we can see there that our parts from the production phase are still along the arrangement. And now we're ready to bring in the stems. So I'm just going to navigate to the stems folder. Just audition a few of these so we can make sure we've got the right stems. And then what we can now do is just select all of these and drag these into the session view. And we'll see these appear. If we press Command, we can make them go across, so we've got individual tracks for each stem. And now that we've got them into the session view, what we can now do, if we just scroll up, and we can select all of these, and we can just tab these across into the arrangement view. So I'm just going to do that now. And once we have these tracks in place, we can go through and delete any ones that we no longer need. So there'll be things like some reverbs in there that we can get rid of. This will make the signal quite dry, but when we put these in place in the production, we didn't have the rest of the track in place, so we can do that now at the mixdown stage with a much more informed decision. But if you are happy with your reverbs, then by all means you can leave those in. We're also not going to need the kick group because we're going to be regrouping it shortly. We have got the kick parallel. I'm going to keep that in for now, but we may decide to do parallel compression, so we won't actually need that. We've also got the percussion bus, which we're not going to need, so we can get rid of that. And we're literally just working through. We've got the reference tracks as well in here. And we've also got a few more buses that we can get rid of and parts. So we're just going to delete everything apart from the actual tracks that we're going to be mixing down. I'm just going to rename this last one to Ref Rough, because what this is the pre-mix down. So what we can do is we can use that to reference to in case we get a little bit lost on our mix down and we change the sound a little bit too much. So it's always good to have a rough reference as well as your other references in the track somewhere, just in case you need to check it. So that is actually quite an important point to note, is that when you do export all your individual tracks, it will also export the master bus as well, which is what it's done here. So when you do play back all your tracks in the arrangement, ready to mix them down, if you do find that there's a lot of level jumping around, or if it doesn't sound quite the same, then it's probably because you've got a exact replica of your mix down playing underneath, which will be this Ref Rough that you have here. So just to play this so you can hear how it sounds. So as you can hear, that's exactly the same as it was in the production phase. And if I click on it, you can see it isn't warped. And if for some reason your tracks are warping, if you go to preferences, all we can do is we can turn the auto warp long samples off. And to do that, we have to go to the record warp launch tab, and we've got this button here. And then we can also change the default warp mode. I recommend leaving warp off and just making sure that you have the track set at the correct BPM, unless you've got a very specific reason to, because some of the warp engines can have an effect on the audio and make it sound different from how you produced it. So the next part of mix prep is ordering our tracks. So we're going to go for the kick at the very top. And I'm just going to really quickly get all these in order. And when you're doing the mixdown process or any process within Ableton, I suggest you stick to a strategic way of doing things and then use that for every single project. So always have your kicks at the top, then have your bass, then have your percussion, then have your synths, vocals and effects. If you work in that way, then you always know where to go to for any given sound straight away. So now we're just going to go through and rename these. So as you can see, I've got my kicks, I've got my bass, I've then got my percussion, I've then got my synths, and I've then got my vocals. So now what we're going to do is we're going to rename the clips as well, and this might seem like overkill, but if we go and slice this clip here, then you can see it renames the second part to kick as well. So while all of our stems or our tracks are one long clip, you might as well rename them all, and then when we go into the slicing stage in a minute, then it's going to make it nice and easy for us to see exactly what's going on within the project. The next stage, once we've done the renaming for the clips and the tracks, is to do the color coding. So it's completely up to you how you want to color code it. I always go for red for my kick, and then I go for brown for bass, orange for percussion, and then it doesn't really matter after that. As long as you have a color code that you stick to and use throughout all your projects, then it's just an extra way of seeing what's going on nice and quickly. So at the moment, the clips or the tracks are the entire length of our track, and we can't actually see the arrangement properly. So now we're going to go into the next stage, which is slicing or stripping the silence. This is a little bit easier to do in some other DAWs, but if we just stretch out our tracks as big as we can so we can see the waveform, then we can just zoom in and we can chop out the sections of the arrangement. And what we need to be aware of here is the tail might go past where you're trying to slice. So what you have to do is solo the track and just make sure you definitely know where the waveform ends. And you have to actually check the meters when you do that, rather than relying on what you see within the track, because sometimes you can get really low level reverbs and delays, and you don't want to be chopping these off. So as you can see there, if we look in the meter, we know it doesn't go past this point here, and then what we can do is we can just slice these parts out using Command E and the delete function just to get rid of all of these parts that we don't need. So I'm now just going to work my way through the track, doing this nice and quickly so as not to waste your time. And this isn't a necessity, but I do recommend doing it because it is a good idea. It keeps the project nice and clean, and also every now and then you'll find a few little mistakes. Like here we've got this extra kick drum that I can get rid of, and I wouldn't have found that if I didn't do this process. So if we do happen to chop across a zero crossing point, then what we can do is we can go into the mixer for the track and we can set a fade and just pull that in, and that's just going to nicely round off that volume there so we don't get a click or a pop. So we can do that throughout the project as and where we need to. So this part can be quite tedious, but it's definitely worth doing just so you can see exactly what's going on in your project from a glance, and just to also double check that you haven't made any mistakes within the production phase. So what we can do now is we can just drag all these tracks down so we can see them all onto one page or all within the arrangement window. And now we're going to move on to the second part of the mix preparation phase before finally moving into the first part of the mixdown. So I'll see you in the next video.